component.
Cars had become the big question of the future, after the First World War. So you had many people talking about it, writing about it, thinking about it in the universities, in the newspapers, all over Europe. In America at the time, Henry Ford had invented the Model T, which was a people's car. The idea of what was happening in America, this mass motorization where normal people working normal jobs could afford a car, that was a huge change.
A car comes off the end of the line every 10 seconds.
People were talking about that in Europe on many different levels, hoping that somehow they could create a car that would do what the Model T did in America.
Ferdinand Porsche did not come up with this concept of the car that became the Beetle just out of thin air. There were a number of designers experimenting with various pieces of this. He's actually working within kind of a collective school of thought, a general set of ideas for what could make a great people's car. And there were some very key players that arguably did more to develop what the Beetle became than Porsche did himself. Some of these people have been almost erased from the historical record. There was a motor journalist at the time named Josef Ganz. He wrote for a magazine called Motor Critic. He was a Jew.
You have a very important person, Josef Ganz, writing about it quite a lot and making a big stir about Germany needs a car, needs to motorize a population like America, and this is the future.
He himself was contracted by companies to make cars as well, to design things. And when he started designing cars on his own, he would use a backbone chassis, again, something that you'll see later in the Beetle, swing axles, also the later Beetle, engine behind the driver, and streamlined bodies. And if you think about what the early Beetle was, it was all of these things. And he actually called this car the Maybug. So we even get etymological names. The seeds of what became the Beetle were there. This was a pool of ideas. And one of the biggest people who input into that pool was Josef Ganz.
He was incredibly vocal, and he was unabashed in going for this idea. He had a lot of passion for it.
Ganz' biggest success was a car called the Standard Superior. And the Standard Superior, if you look at it now, looks a hell of a lot like a very, very early Beetle. The Standard Superior was a little Beetle-like car. It was two-door, it had a backbone chassis, rear-mounted engine. And this car was sold. It was sold, and it was sold under the name Volkswagen, in the generic sense of the name. There's ads from that era, Standard Superior, and it cost like 1,600 Reichmarks, and it was one of the cheapest cars you could get in Germany at the time. You can trace the roots of the Beetle back to Josef Ganz as much as you can Ferdinand Porsche, I believe.
Many of those people were Jewish, as it turned out, and were persecuted when the Nazis came to power. So a lot of their stories have sort of gotten lost.
He was eventually forced out of his position in the magazine Motor Critic because of pressure from the Nazis. They were taking away his livelihood. He was actually imprisoned. They just made life intolerable for him. And these people used his status as a Jew as a way to basically just eliminate him as any sort of credible threat. And in the end, they won. Josef Ganz was effectively erased from the VW story. It's a relief, in a way, that seminal in the Beetle's design may have actually been a Jew himself. It's like this thing wasn't entirely, born out of these horrible circumstances by this madman.
Germany was partitioned after the war, and the Allies each took a zone. So you had the British zone, you had the American zone, you had the Russian zone, and the French zone. And the Volkswagen factory happened to be in the British zone.
So it's a kind of difficult thing to stomach, the idea that Hitler was involved. So I focused more on the British Army going in there and teaching the bloody Nazis how to behave, That's what I like to focus on.
Part of the reason why the British were so eager to get it up in production was so the Russians couldn't have it. There was also a big economic need because a lot of Germans now were suddenly destitute, without jobs, without anywhere to go.
The British really kind of fell in love with the car. There was a man named Ivan Hirst who was a British officer who found himself in control of the plant at the end of the war, and also unexpectedly sort of fell in love with the car in a way that would forecast the way millions of people would fall in love with the car. It was largely due to his efforts that the car survived the occupation of Germany and eventually was in the position to become a mass-marketed vehicle.
The Volkswagen in general is very, very important for the Germans because